He thought this would be just another takedown, another conservative politician walking straight into his trap. Daniel Harper had spent years humiliating guests on live television, exposing their so-called contradictions and making them crumble under pressure. But tonight, something was different. Because the woman sitting across from him wasn't rattled. She wasn't playing defense. And within minutes, she would turn the entire interview and his career completely upside down. The lights in the studio burned hot, reflecting off the sleek, polished desk where Daniel Harper sat, reviewing his notes one last time. The stage was set. The producers were in place. The cameras were rolling. And in just a few minutes, he was going to do what he did best: expose and dismantle his guest in front of a live national audience. Daniel wasn't just a journalist. He was a seasoned political interrogator, known for his aggressive, calculated style of questioning. He had spent years crafting a reputation as the man who could make even the most composed conservatives crack under pressure. His show, Harper Unfiltered, was a staple of mainstream media, a place where right-wing politicians came to be embarrassed, and left-wing narratives went unchallenged. Tonight, his target was Karoline Leavitt. She had been making waves, young, sharp, and completely unfazed by the relentless media machine that sought to tear her down. While many conservative politicians stumbled when facing tough media scrutiny, Karoline was different. She was bold, articulate, and dangerously effective at countering leftist narratives, which was exactly why Daniel wanted her on his show. He had spent days preparing for this interview, analyzing every one of her past statements, policy positions, and viral social media moments. His producers had provided him with highlight reels, every moment where she had clashed with reporters, every time she had gone viral with a soundbite that resonated with conservatives. Tonight, his goal was clear: frame her as extreme, push her into a defensive position, and make her stumble. He had done it before, and he was certain he would do it again. 2 minutes to air, the producer's voice crackled in his earpiece. Daniel adjusted his tie, glancing at the empty chair across from him, the one Karoline would occupy. "She's not ready for this," he muttered to himself, rolling his pen between his fingers. "She's never faced someone like me." The theme music kicked in. The giant screen behind him flashed the title of the segment in bold, capitalized letters: Exposing the Right, an unfiltered interview with Karoline Leavitt. The camera light blinked red. Showtime. Then, something unexpected happened. The moment Karoline Leavitt walked onto the set, something shifted. Daniel had expected nerves, maybe a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, or a stiff, rigid posture that betrayed unease. That's how most of his conservative guests looked before he went to work on them. But Karoline? She moved with complete confidence. Her shoulders were back, her head was high, her steps were smooth and deliberate. She slid into her chair with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. No fidgeting, no awkward glances at the cameras. She looked completely in control. Daniel's usual smirk flickered for half a second, so quick most wouldn't have noticed. But his producer saw it. He cleared his throat, regained his composure. "Stay on offense," he reminded himself. He still had control. "Karoline, thanks for being here," he began, his voice professional, even. "Thanks for having me, Daniel," she replied smoothly, her tone unreadable. Daniel didn't waste time. "You've positioned yourself as a fresh voice in conservative politics," he began. "But a lot of people say you're just repackaging outdated ideas with a younger face. What do you say to critics who believe you're simply carrying water for the same old Republican establishment?" It was a classic opening move. Frame her as a puppet. Force her to prove otherwise. make her scramble. But Karoline didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, as if she had already anticipated the question. "It's interesting," she said, "how when young progressives rise in politics, they're called trailblazers. But when a young conservative does, they're accused of being a mouthpiece. Seems like a bit of a double standard, don't you think?" Her response was so fast, so sharp, that Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being thrown off balance this early. The control room buzzed. His producers were watching closely, monitoring live reactions. Daniel adjusted, shifting gears. "Keep pressing." "Let's talk about policy," he said, recovering quickly. "You've been vocal in your opposition to certain progressive economic measures, yet many young people overwhelmingly support them. Why should they listen to someone arguing against policies they believe will help them?" Another trap. Make her seem out of touch with her own generation. But Karoline didn't flinch. "Young people don't just support ideas because they sound good," she said, leaning forward slightly. "They support what actually works. And if you look at the states that have implemented these so-called solutions, you'll see higher costs of living, businesses leaving, and fewer job opportunities. Young Americans deserve real solutions, not just feel-good slogans." Daniel tightened his grip on his pen. The audience couldn't see it, but he could feel control slipping. Not completely. Not yet. But the dynamic wasn't playing out the way he had planned. The live chat was already buzzing. Some viewers were agreeing with Daniel. But others? They were engaging with Karoline's points. And that was a problem. She wasn't supposed to be winning people over. Daniel forced a quick smile, a practiced move to mask the slight miscalculation in his opening attack. This wasn't the first time a guest had pushed back, but something about Karoline felt different. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't scrambling. She was in control. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but pointed. "Karoline, let's be honest," he said. "Your party has struggled with young voters. A majority of them reject conservative policies on climate change, health care, and social justice. When you speak, aren't you just preaching to a shrinking audience?" The phrasing was deliberate. Back her into a corner. Make her admit defeat. But again, she didn't hesitate. "Daniel, if we're being honest, then let's actually be honest," she shot back, her tone calm but firm. "Young people aren't rejecting conservative values. They're rejecting a version of conservatism that hasn't been properly explained to them. If all they ever hear is a media narrative that paints one side as villains and the other as saviors, of course they'll lean left. The problem isn't the message. It's the messengers." Daniel shifted in his seat. She wasn't just responding. She was taking control of the conversation. His earpiece crackled. His producer's voice came through. "Stay on offense. Tighten the grip." Daniel nodded slightly. This wasn't over. He still had one more play. Daniel glanced at his notes, then at the camera. It was time to shift gears. When facts and policy didn't work, there was always another strategy. Go personal. He leaned forward, adopting a more serious tone. "Some have criticized your rhetoric as being divisive," he said, his voice carrying an air of concern. "You've made strong comments about the media, calling certain outlets activists pretending to be journalists. Do you think that kind of language helps bridge divides, or are you just feeding into the partisanship that's tearing the country apart?" This was supposed to hit her where it hurt. Make her seem extreme, make her backpedal. But she didn't. Instead, Karoline let a small, knowing smile cross her lips. "I find it interesting, Daniel," she said smoothly, "that when conservatives call out media bias, it's labeled divisive. But when the media runs hit pieces full of half-truths and anonymous sources. It's called investigative journalism. The way she delivered that line, unshaken, deliberate, made Daniel shift in his seat. She wasn't just defending herself, she was exposing the entire game. The control room was dead silent. No one dared interrupt the live broadcast. The tension between them was thick, and Daniel knew that audiences across the country were glued to their screens, waiting to see who would crack first. His earpiece crackled again. A producer's whisper, "Stay on offense." Daniel nodded subtly, refocusing. He still had one last move left, and this time he wasn't holding back. Daniel could feel it now, the shift in power. This wasn't going according to plan. He had prepared to grill Karoline, to push her into a defensive posture where she would stumble, fumble, or at least give him a sound bite that could be clipped and circulated. But she wasn't playing the role he had assigned her. His producer's voice came through again. "Tighten the grip. Push her." Fine. Time to abandon subtlety. Daniel leaned in, adjusting his tone to something colder, more surgical. "Karoline, let's cut through the talking points," he said. "You've criticized the media for pushing narratives, but isn't that exactly what you're doing? You present yourself as an outsider speaking truth, yet you're backed by political donors and powerful figures. How is that any different from the system you claim to oppose?" It was a direct attack, one meant to undermine her credibility. If she hesitated even for a moment, he could seize control of the conversation again. But Karoline didn't. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were sizing him up. Then she exhaled and spoke, slow, measured, devastatingly precise. "I'm glad you brought that up, Daniel," she said, "because it proves my point. When a conservative gets backing, it's called dark money and corruption. But when a liberal candidate raises millions from Hollywood and tech billionaires, it's called grassroots enthusiasm. Funny how that works." Daniel's pulse ticked up. He had another move, a riskier one. Since he was losing control, Daniel went for the nuclear option. "Since we're talking about narratives," he pressed, "you've been accused of pushing misinformation, particularly regarding election integrity and media bias. Would you like to clarify some of your previous claims?" This was his last-ditch effort. Throw a wide net and hope she got tangled in it. He needed a misstep, a fumble, anything to regain his footing. But instead, Karoline let a moment of silence pass before answering. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She waited. And then, finally, she spoke. Slow, deliberate, unshaken. "What's interesting, Daniel, is that you frame this as misinformation, without specifying what exactly was false," she said, locking eyes with him. "That's what the media does. You take a broad accusation, repeat it often enough, and expect people to just accept it as fact. So tell me, what exactly did I say that was false?" Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough. He knew what she was doing. She was forcing him to be specific. And the problem was, he hadn't actually prepared to debate details. His strategy had been to paint her with a broad brush, not to engage on the specifics. The seconds ticked by. The control room knew he was cornered. His producer's voice was in his ear again. "Move on. Move on." He swallowed, forcing a small smirk, trying to make it seem like he wasn't affected. "Well, Karoline, our viewers can judge for themselves." A weak pivot, a retreat disguised as neutrality. But Karoline had already won this round, and the audience knew it. Daniel could feel it now. He wasn't just losing control. He had already lost it. Karoline sat across from him, completely composed, her confidence unshaken. The more he tried to steer the conversation, the more she tightened her grip on the moment. And the worst part? The audience could see it. The live chat was on fire. His producers were scrambling in his ear, throwing suggestions, but none of them mattered. Daniel had to regain control himself, and there was only one way left to do it. He pivoted hard. "Karoline, let's talk about accountability," he said, straightening his posture. His voice took on a sharper edge, a last-ditch attempt at regaining his footing. "You speak about media bias, yet conservatives are no strangers to misleading claims and inflammatory rhetoric. Do you take responsibility for contributing to division in this country? Frame her as the problem. Make her justify herself." He watched closely, waiting for a sign of frustration, a tightening jaw, a flicker of annoyance, anything that showed he was getting to her. But Karoline didn't take the bait. Instead, she exhaled softly, just enough to show she had been expecting this. "That's an interesting question, Daniel," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Do you ask progressive politicians the same thing? Or does accountability only run one way?" A pause. A long, deadly pause. Daniel felt the silence crush in on him. She hadn't just answered his question. She had flipped it back on him. And worse, he had no way to wiggle out of it. He let out a small, controlled breath. But the damage was already done. The live chat was brutal. People weren't just watching an interview. They were watching a demolition. Clips of the exchange were already spreading across social media. Daniel's face was everywhere, screen-grabbed, memed, mocked. Even some left-leaning commentators were calling out the failure. His phone buzzed, a message from his network executive. "Call me. Now." And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a career moment he might never live down.